Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sister's keeper? This was the theme of an international online webinar for mental health professionals on the sibling dynamics in therapy and psychoanalysis, and on the existential replacement child condition. On behalf of the replacementchildforum.com, I have great pleasure in sharing with you a dialogue during that webinar, which took place between Professor Henry Abramovitch from Tel Aviv University, founder and senior teaching analyst with the Israeli Jung Institute, and author of a book entitled Brothers and Sisters, Myth and Reality. I am the co-founder of the replacementchildforum.com website, together with Judy Mandel and Rita Batat. I am the author of a book entitled Individuation for Adult Replacement Children, Ways of Coming into Being. And I am a senior analyst and supervisor with the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, Küsnacht, Switzerland. This dialogue between Henry and myself was a unique opportunity to share our experience, our reflections, with those who are working with human beings who basically suffer from some sibling relationship, and some who suffer from the replacement child condition because the sibling is no longer there. We are very pleased to share this dialogue with you. If you enjoy it, please write to us. If you would like to have the opportunity to partake in a similar webinar, to share personal material, clinical material, to have the chance for a supervision of a case, please let us know, and we will be happy to share the experience, to exchange, so that we will all make this a better world for brothers and sisters, for all of us. We wish you happy holidays and a happy, healthy New Year for you and your family.
I'll ask you,
Yes.
Kristina, why are siblings grow up in the same family? They're genetically more similar than anybody else, but in practice, why are siblings so different?
I think you give a very good answer in your book, which you're talking about niches, that one spot, one position, one area of excellence and expertise and being is already taken. So another sibling in the family will have to look for another spot, for another place. So I think that's very often seen in families, that children will not take that hobby that another sibling has already is doing. So it's a way to differentiate. I also, though, think it has to do, certainly, as you write, also with the birth order, you know, that a middle child is different from a firstborn or from a little baby brother, baby sister position. And I also think it has to do with, of course, how the parent relates and what kind of sibling experience the parent might have had and the parent might project onto one of the siblings in the sibling birth order. What do you think, Henry?
Well, since I agree, I think this is true, that is, our identity as siblings is very much dependent on who we aren't. And in a sense, that's why I think sibling work is so important for individuation, Because if we divided up the world, say for women, one is the beautiful one, so the other is the smart one. The smart one will never feel she's beautiful and has to leave it out of her identity. And the beautiful one thinks she's a dummy. But to have individuation, we have to connect with all of our sides. And that's why I think sibling work is really the key for us integrating these different aspects of ourselves. I think the parents are also obviously crucial. And it's what I've come to call, is the family a culture of scarcity or a culture of surplus? Now, in a culture of scarcity, there's not enough to go around. And this you see again and again in all the biblical stories. You know, if one person gets, there's nothing left for the other one. It's like there can be only one favorite child, so forth. And therefore, everything you get is at the cost of anything else. And that exacerbates all the tension that the temperament or family things like this, and of course, the impact of the parents' experience as siblings, which is very often passed down to the next generation, unconsciously or consciously, of finding that way. You know, Elisa, you said you're in a family of 6, which is unusual in this group, but in Jerusalem, we have families of 18. And sometimes in those families, ultra-Orthodox or Palestinian Muslims particularly, in those families, sometimes amazingly, you have a culture of surplus, which means that there's one mom and one dad, but everybody feels like they're the best child. Because when you have, it's like when there's more than enough for everyone to give this type of thing. And that, I think, reduces the nature of the natural tendency to conflict, to finding your place and doing this sort of thing. And that's very difficult because often it's just you're stuck with one or anything. But I think once you leave the family, you can say, I don't have to live in that culture of scarcity. I can recreate a culture of surplus or things like this. Or we saw in some of the examples of like Irma, of how the translation was done when your sister could discover a new relationship to you, not only as a sister, but as an aunt, and it gave her new purpose, a new position. And like through the children, they can get together now, and brought this kind of dramatic transformation that came about.
Yeah. What I find amazing in what you say, Henry, is that scarcity or surplus is not about things, it's about relation.
Yeah.
It's the relational openness, it's the love that is either difficult to have or there is enough to go around. And I think that has also very, very much to do with how the parents are able to love themselves, love each other, have been loved, and then can love the children. I think that that's where there is a lot of transgenerational transmission.
Yes. Let me just give one biblical story that's not so well known, which is Jacob has his mother's love, but not his father's love. And of course, that's what you yearn for. But to get his father's love, he has to disguise himself as his brother. It's like a persona. And he steals the blessing. And then there's this tremendously poignant moment when his brother comes back, his twin brother comes back from the field hunting, and he sees what has happened. And he says, Father, is there not another blessing for me?
It's very moving, no?
Let me ask you a question about replacement child. What is a replacement child, and is it inevitable?
A replacement child, and this we discussed 22, 23 years ago, is one, as you write in your book, who takes the place of another, or is, as we discussed at the time, who takes the role of another. Most often of a child that died. It could have been before, but that's a big misperception, that it's a replacement child only if a child has died before it and a new one was conceived, made, born. It can equally happen that the replacement child is one that is living and they're growing up together, and a child dies and suddenly that role or that place gets transferred either by a parent or by self-identification. So it's very fluid. It's the replacement really means I'm not me, I'm not having my place I'm standing in, I'm replacing for another. And I mean, there are cases where a child replaces a grandparent or even a parent. So this is in larger circles, very encompassing many, many situations. But no, it's not inevitable that if a member of the family dies, if a sibling dies, that the following child or the surviving child will be a replacement child. It depends on many factors, many, many factors. But chiefly also, as you write, it's about grieving. Has the grieving been done in such a way that the disappearance of that one human being, of that sibling or other member, is accepted, not accepted as a death, death is never accepted, but yes, that person is gone. And it cannot be balanced out by another person doing as if it was the missing person. So it is evitable, if you wish, if there is awareness, if there is counseling, if there is grieving, grief accompanied. I think that's a huge bit of prevention. And then I think this is sort of at the beginning, but as my own path has taught me, and as many of you who have shared their path with me and people I worked with, I would have said for a long time, I'm a replacement child. I'm no longer saying I'm a replacement child. I'm Kristina, who was born as a replacement child. And so that's the issue. Even if one is coming into the world or gets a role or a place assigned or chooses oneself such a thing, you don't have to keep that identity of being a replacement child. That's, I think, the wonderful, the hopeful message, particularly of the Jungian individuation course or other existential, psychoanalytical or therapeutic approaches. We can develop, we can become conscious of what it is that we carry, and we can move towards the kernel, the inner kernel of who we are, towards ourselves.
Yes. Well, I want to give an example of what you say, not necessarily a preborn. The J.W. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan and many other extraordinary things about the life of a puer, live in Never Neverland. He was Scottish, and his older brother, who was 13, I think, or 14, was skating, and he crashed into the ice and drowned. And he was 6 or 7 at the time. And he, in a very dramatic way, took it upon himself to console his mother. He dressed up like his brother. He tried to get her to speak to him like his brother. And he became, even at 7, which normally you'd think personality is well formed at that time. But I think this highlights, I did want to ask, maybe I'll come back to this in a minute. Like, what are the benefits of being a replacement child? But before that, I want to say, one thing that we think we both have found over and over again is that, there's very little training about siblings or replacement child. And I've had the experience, and I'm sure you had too, which is you have a patient and you know something is strange about this patient. And they don't know anything about their birth history or people who died before. But I think today we can guess that somebody is a replacement child from certain symptoms and signs. And what do you think they would be? And I'll also chip in.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. Just to add another rather unusual situation I have right now in my practice. One is a person who is replacing a child who was lost in a bad divorce, right? Never seen again by the mother after the divorce, new child born. Another 2 situations, one brother is very ill, psychiatrically ill, suffers from schizophrenia, and another one has gotten into a heroin addiction and is not getting out. These 2 are replacement situations. How do we get to know that we might be dealing either with a disappearance or with another kind of replacing a missing member? the first thing I would say is we should ask for it. I think otherwise, I have myself been, with all my consciousness, been misled in not getting it for quite some time. So I now ask. I simply ask. I will ask, well, you know, what is the birth order? Are there children that were lost or not wanted or stillborn? Or I will just simply ask and maybe ascertain that with a family tree, a genogram, because it will be eaten quickly by the unconscious, either by the patient or analysand, or even by the analyst. This can drop so quickly into the unconscious. And again, we will need to be coming back to this question, to this issue, and bring it to the foreground. Why is it neglected? As I think this was one question also that you had, Henry, and I think it is neglected because it's unconscious and because it has to do with very painful, traumatic experiences that are relegated to the unconscious. So we are always sort of struggling with something nearly being eaten up by Pac-Man, and we want to get that consciousness really, really sort of into the foreground.
Yes.
What are the symptoms, you asked me? Would you like to add something?
Maybe I'll say something with this. Yeah. I mean, I think part of the problem is very often the patient doesn't know because the parents never told them. True. And they won't tell them, or they're dead, so they don't get that history. I mean, I think what you're suggesting is good in a kind of like routine way to ask about this. Yeah. But I think the way I think about replacement child is that, you know, the unresolved grief is folded into the patient's unconscious. And so often people have replacement childs or missing siblings, which is another big theme in Genesis. Their inner life doesn't belong to them in the way it belongs to kind of somebody who's born in an ordinary way. And there's a kind of almost mystical or disruptive concern for spirits, for ghosts. I mean, Jung was a replacement child, and indeed he fits the profile very clearly. His concern with ghosts, with spirits, with searching for himself, with finding what parts belong to him, and so forth, attraction to death. I think these are some of the symptoms that sometimes you just feel if you kind of like be keyed into them and then assume this sort of way, in the way we would, for instance, you know, people have signs of, say, dissociation and things like that. So we would just assume that perhaps there is a trauma, even a sexual trauma, that the person doesn't really experience, but is there. We have to kind of treat them in a similar way, that there is this hiddenness about the things. Also, people who are replacement children, often they wonder, like, did they have a right to be born? Which is not a question I think a normal love child asks themselves. But if your brother had not died, would they have had another child? And also, we have these crazy examples. For instance, sometimes we know that being a replacement child can be a source of enormous creativity, as it was for Jung and for Van Gogh and Dali, among many others, Beethoven, Goethe, and many others. And in the case of both Van Gogh and Dali, unbelievable, the parents had a child who died as an infant, and they immediately, 9 months and a few days later, had another child. And what did they call this new child? The same name.
So that's the one thing not to do.
Of course, but it's like, if you want to avoid the pain, that's a great way to avoid the pain, because like it didn't happen. And Salvador Dali has this great quote, which I think you use very effectively in your book, Kristina, which is, people said to him, Dali, why are you such an extraordinarily extrovert? And he said, you know why? I have to prove to myself and the world that I am the living Salvador Dali and not the dead Salvador Dali. I would say that's a typical feeling of a replacement child, that somebody who is not a replacement child, they would never go there.
So I think that's so important for all of us in working with ourselves and with clients. is that funny feeling, that absence feeling, that not quite attachment feeling, that not quite here feeling. And that can be something we shirk away from. We might not wish to get involved with that. The one trouble I have, and I do that a lot, is also I refer to the famous replacement children, but through the Replacement Child Forum, we also came in touch with very, very many people who are just the opposite of a famous replacement child, who say, I feel so worthless. I have no worth in my life. And that lack of self-esteem, other than that uncanniness and ghostness, is, I think, a prime signal for me now, as symptoms where I will go and see what is the root cause of that worthlessness, of that lack of self-esteem, self-love. Because, and you take it in your book also towards the self-sacrificial. Definitely, there can be the reason, why am I alive? But then if I am alive, then do I honor and treasure my life, or am I even able to give it up, or am I willing to give it up? Could I be suicidal? And another symptom in that has to do, of course, with the attachment, right? It's the beginning of the attachment of the parent. Is it really with a new child, or is it with a memory of the old child superimposed? And that we will feel in the practice also. You know, are they attached to us? Do we feel them? Are they with us? Are we with them? And I think that's really the main question that I look out. Could it be that there is something? Because if somebody asks me, what is the long-term effect, the biggest long-term effect for me is certainly it's a relational challenge. Relational, the attachment and the relational, and that carries on into adult life. That has repercussions.
Yes. Well, I would just finish with what you say. I think the people who you met through the forum and feel they're worthless are similar to the people like Jung and Dali, except they took the challenge. You know, it's always a question, why is somebody resilient and somebody then fragmented? So I'm going to prove that I'm worthwhile. You know, obviously there are other elements that have to do with this sort of thing. Let me go back to sibling wounds in general, not just with replacement child. We'll come back to that.
Sure.
And how does this play out? Well, let me I'll say something, and then I'll ask you then to respond. See, I think we're very well trained to understand a mother transference, positive, negative, a father transference, negative. But because sibling relationships are so important and carry so much eros or thanatos, we do experience, our patients experience us as brothers, as sisters, as positive. And maybe I'll just give a short vignette. Maybe you can also think of the vignette. I'm thinking of a man who came to me. He was one of these, I would say, able complexes, very successful, but not able to feel good about himself. He came in a kind of very hard midlife crisis. We worked very well, but from the beginning, I felt something wasn't right. It wasn't a replacement child thing, but I actually thought it was going to be like a Freudian repressed trauma. And and we were working very well on his issues. I mean, the other issues besides this, but you know, sometimes you just have a clinical intuition that there's like something else, the way you would with a replacement child. In this case, it turned out to be a trauma. He said that what happened, and this is like a synchronistic thing, by chance we met at a art gallery opening. And I just very briefly came up to him, I said hello, and then I immediately left, out of the idea that I'm going to do everything to protect the Temenos. He's a very warm and friendly guy, you know, somebody who could have been a friend had we not met in therapy. And he said to me, but why did you leave? You know, what was the problem? I said, well, I wanted to do everything to protect the Temenos, and even though there was a tiny chance he would do that. And he started crying. He said, no one had ever done that to him. And then he says, and there is something I'm not telling you. And it's not a repressed secret. It's something that I think about. And talk about self-sacrifice, every Yom Kippur, I beat myself up because I feel I've done a terrible thing. What it turned out that when he was a youngest child, maybe like an early adolescent, he was sexually abused by the maid. And unfortunately, his family was such that he never told anybody about it. And he probably was right not to tell, because after years of therapy, he finally told his father. And his father's only reaction was, well, what do you want me to do about it now? Like really sharp and things like that. He had a younger sister who was a special needs. He had an older brother who was completely castrated by the father. He, in a way, was as if the more successful one, and this type of thing. And I felt the healing came through me as being that older brother he never had. Caring, patient, never letting him down. You know, I often think a lot of why analysis works is because we're very reliable, much more reliable than real life is. You know, we're supposed to be always there. We're supposed to always be caring. We're supposed to always reflect. Even if we make a mistake, we'll think about it, we'll apologize, or things like that. You know, the Klein instinct, like the kind of continuity of good breastfeeding, but it's much more than that. It's relationship. And I feel it was through the healing counter-transference of me being that warm, caring, close brother that brought him to another place. Maybe you have a story?
I have a question for you on that.
Go ahead.
I'll see that. Did you feel like an older brother? And were you happy? Because you are a younger brother. So how did you get to the older brother counter-transference?
I think this is very important. Well, first of all, yes, to both. But let me explain. First of all, in the world of imagination, and in the book, I give active imagination that is by chance, say, Monica, by chance you're the middle child. But in an archetypal imagination, you can be anything. You could be a twin, you could be an only child, you can know those. And all of those inner sibling resources are available to you when you need them in therapy. Or when you need them, but let's say in therapy, it can be also in relationships. And therefore you can draw on something that's beyond your own experience. I think in my own personal case, as I hinted, you know, there is this sort of game which is like, oh, what do you think my birth order is? But again, it's not the birth order, it's the niche. So even though I'm the youngest, in some ways I'm the oldest.
Yeah, it's the niche. And then I think that's so fascinating in the individuation world, the Jungian world, right?
Yeah.
Because we will try and reach out to the other side in order to become whole.
Exactly.
And that's what I feel very much in the practice I have with the people with whom I work. I get very little mother transference. And that might be because I myself will offer more of a sibling transference. I will protect, be there, be loyal, available, willing to adventure, willing to suffer together, okay? But it will be on an equal level. But that was really something that came to me with time. And that's so important for us if we are in that situation ourselves as a replacement child therapist or analyst, or we might have had a parent who was in that situation and we still have some of that in us. Because until I had worked it through that this brother was missing and that I was so much longing for that brother, I wouldn't have had that possibility to offer that sibling transference to the person I work with, because I probably would have projected the missingness or even a different attitude to a parent. I had a very negative mother complex because I felt I never connected with my mother. But in my practice, in all cases almost, I don't get that mother transference or authority transference. I get a sibling transference. And that is kind of dear to me because it means of this coming together, right? It's the yin and the yang, and it's the anima and the animus, and it's the brother and the sister meeting, and that becomes a potential experience for wholeness. I think that's really what I think also was at play in the case that you have just presented.
Mm. I wanted just to say you're continuing that Jung's own theme. People who were in analysis with him say he was not a father, he was a brother.
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I think I would have to say theoretically that we need to be able to offer lots of different transferences, counter-transference to different kinds of people.
Yeah.
So maybe because I'm Jewish, it's easy for me to be in a maternal position, you know, like that's easy.
I also think that Jungian psychology is more maternal and Freudian psychoanalysis is more paternal. It's a sort of a perception I have in that it is very understanding, receiving, containing, etc. Yes, we should offer the other ones, but I think that's in terms of if you're moving towards individuation and towards wholeness.
Let me just say something. I think about a clinical vignette of your own, but let me just talk about only children, of which I guess we don't have anyone here. But my wife's an only child, and I'm very interested in the only child. And I suggest that only children have lots of brothers and sisters, but that we're in the world of imagination. And in fact, they may be even more important because an only child is more dependent on a parent than a child with brothers or sisters. And that causes a, you know, kind of a tension between being too dependent or being very lonely in this sort of ways. And I think the more an only child has a connection with these inner brothers and sisters, they can find that third space between being like isolated and between being over dependent on these things. So paradoxically, I think only children have the more profound relationship with brothers and sisters because it's only in imagination.
Yes, if they can access that. Yes, and we can help them to access.
Right, exactly.
Yes. Maybe I can quickly give a little insight into one case, because this is also a replacement child situation when a mother has experienced pregnancies but lost pregnancies before, and then comes a child. And I'm working with a young man whose mother had lost 3 children at various stages of pregnancy before him. And he is just the absolute golden beloved child, but he's like the property almost of the mother. I think that the mother had a hard time letting him go and kept him very, very young for a very, very long time. And it was amazing to see how in the beginning of the analysis, very early came an image of a plant high up on a balcony and without any soil. So there was a root sort of dangling, but it didn't reach soil and it couldn't grow. And I think that was an apt image for his hanging in there as the one alive child, but not having the access to the earth in which he himself could be securely embedded and grow deep roots and grow as a flower or as a tree or whatever it was up. And that then came forward in the analysis. And, you know, we will have in the shadow, we will have those other non-presences, you know, and we will need to see and receive the non-presence of those who were not. And it's interesting. Now, he knew that, he was told this, but others are not told. And yet, probably it may come up. It may come up either in their interests, could just come up in what they read and what they draw and what they are drawn towards. It could come up in the choice of partner, who could be a mirror image of what happened to them. Or it could just come up as this feeling of something you cannot touch, you know, that air of secret. And it can come up in a dream. So in dreams, we will see people who were absent. And one of the most uncanny things was for me when I entered the Jung Institute, 1996, biggest gift to myself I ever gave. It was given to me rather. I had a dream of a bed in Jung's house being turned upside down and 3 kittens being hidden underneath. I had no idea about his 3 siblings that didn't exist. You know, 2 stillborn ones and 1 who lived only for 5 days. But now I can see, yes, the bed had been turned upside down and underneath there were kittens. And he has dreams where he sees his mother with 5, you know, he, his sister, and 3 others. He had a close relationship with his mother, and I think many replacement children, me included, had a negative experience of mother. I experienced her as grieving, dead, depressed, dead mother of Andre Green. Maybe it was the father in Jung's case who was experienced as absent, as not understanding why God took away 3 children. But as I just prepared for us meeting today all together, I looked at this, and yes, you also quoted this, you know, he has a sister 9 years later. What on earth happened in the 9 years?
Yes.
You know, this was in the 1880s, early 80s. Why were there no children in between 1875 and 84? You know, I don't know.
Well, I think I do know.
Okay.
Sex.
Yeah, maybe, but then they did for the sister, and the sister dies prematurely, right? And
the sister dies young. Jung, in his autobiography, it's very interesting. He talks about the birth of the sister as something very frightening, scary. He doesn't understand it. It's birth at home, of course, in that time.
Yeah.
And then that she was like born to be an unmarried spinster, never left home, but was very orderly. And when she died, he found all of her things in it. And I think she had a direct influence on his ideas of psychological types. That is, he learned from the difference through seeing her.
Yes.
9 years apart from a psychological point of view is too far to be a psychological brother-sister relationship.
Yeah.
Like 6, 7 is usually considered the limit, even though you can reconnect as adults, which is very nice, but you don't grow up together, you don't go through developmental periods together. And clearly she was what I call a shadow sibling. You know, everything I'm not.
And he was very astute at getting women. He was very much connecting, you know. There were the young women around him, and he had 2 women that were missing, and he was then looking for his missing soul. I mean, he had a thing. And I wonder what it meant, though, for Gertrude Jung, that she had also those missing siblings. And she obviously must have been preparing for her own death if everything was in order. She had an operation in her 30s or something and just unexpectedly died.
I mean, listen, another possibility is that there were more miscarriages.
Yeah, that's what I started thinking.
Kind of, you know, born into a world without eros, just a worry and difficult. And the way very often in traditional families, say an unmarried child, a woman particularly, an unmarried daughter, sister, will be the one who's just chosen to look after the elderly parents. And the way it's very typically that one child anyway does all the work and the other ones just complain. But I want to give a only child dream, which is one of my favorite. This woman was an only child, and she was getting ready to get married. And then she had this dream. In the dream, her brother came and he forbade her from getting married because he was in love with her and he would not allow her to get married. And she woke up in terror because she didn't have a brother. She was an only child.
And was she?
She had therapy. She went ahead with the marriage.
I know that's good. That's perfect. But then a thing like that would get me going to ask, well, how come she's dreaming about this brother? You know, maybe there was one.
Well, I mean, that's another archetypal theme, which is in mythology, but not in reality, of a marriage between the brother and sister, which is
Yes.
like the perfect marriage of Isis,
This is so
Iris,
important. Yeah.
of Juno, and so forth. There are many in Japan. The founders are brother and sister. There only are, I mean, obviously there are some examples. There's a beautiful novel called Les Enfants Terribles, you know, about these brothers and sisters who run away and get married and have a kind of crazy life by themselves. There are a few things like that. But in anthropology, there are only 3 actual instances where brother-sister marriage was considered not only condoned, but considered holy, and was in the royal courts of Egypt, the Inca, and Hawaii. And in a way, it like highlights what is permitted for the elite is not permitted for anyone else, like a harem. So the king can have a harem, but nobody else can have a harem.
And also the kingdoms stay together.
And it's a kind of divine marriage between the brother and sister, because nobody else can marry her in this sort of way, which of course leads to terrible genetic problems, as like with Akhenaten and all of these sorts of things. But I think there is a yearning, and if you look at the Song of Songs or Egyptian love poetry, often the beloved is called, like in the Song of Songs, the beloved is explicitly called, you know, brother, sister, you know, someone who knows me from my birth. Has a kind of, and in a way, it's I think an ideal way of a relationship that has both a lover quality, but also a familiarity that you only have, like as it were, from birth. In this way.
Beautiful. I think Monica brought that also, the tension of the opposites.
Yes.
Because here we have that divine brother-sister marriage that's also looked for in the individuation process, you know, the alchemical rosarium pictures are showing us brother and sister mating, but then the soul leaving and then coming back again. I think it is absolutely fascinating because, and now that's why I said opposites, I have seen in many cases, an attraction, imagery that could point towards incest, sexual abuse in the family, but it wasn't. In replacement child cases, and this was something I'm still learning, but I have observed in many, many cases that this is symbolical. It is not actual incest. It's not actual sexual abuse, but it is the yearning, and you write about that so beautifully. It's the yearning for the kinship libido. It's the yearning for the absent other that could possibly take that kind of imagery. I mean, there is sexual abuse, there is incest. I've seen cases in practice, I've worked with that. But there is something that we need to know when Thanatos intervened and took away that love, that potential love, that yearning towards coming home, coming towards together, could take that imagery. I thought that's an important.
I just want to say something anthropological. Another problem, I think, why parents have such difficulty mourning. I mean, the words are terrible because they're so impersonal. Miscarriages or stillbirth. In Hebrew, we say silent birth. Or someone born, a few days. Because in most cultures, unlike funerals, which are usually very elaborate, and in many cultures, the most elaborate ritual in the whole culture, there's no rituals, say, take Judaism, but also many other rituals. So certainly a miscarriage would be no ritual. Even a child who's born and lives under 30 days, there would be no funeral. The grave might not even be today. It has to do with what we call in anthropology, and it's the basis of the abortion controversy, which is, when does somebody become a social person? Like, when do you count as a person? So in Judaism, it's very clear. At 30 days, you count. Before 30 days, you don't count.
That's
in other cultures where you have very high mortality, like in Northeast Brazil, you only become a person at 2 years because you're going to die. So why invest in this sort of thing? Say people who are like devotees, say, pro birth, I don't know, Christians, or I mean, we have Jews too like this and so forth. They say, no, you're a person from the moment you're conceived. Therefore, it's a kind of murder, and how we can't do that. So I think without the cultural and ritual support of this, it's, I think, very difficult to mourn. And women are often alone, they're often ashamed, they feel something's wrong with them, they don't get support, often people don't even know. That's a kind of difficulty. And then I want to flash forward to the book of Job. So you all know the book of Job was one of Job's favorites. He, in fact, did it, as you may have known from the play I wrote with Marie Stein, that he wrote it after he had his Kabbalistic visions and his encounter with Rabbi Leo Beck. So Jung comes up with a very interesting interpretation of it, but he misses, I think, the two crucial elements of the book of Job. One is at the beginning of the story. He has 10 children from his wife, and they actually seem to have an ideal sibling relationship. That is, there's 7 brothers and 3 sisters, and everybody dines in turn at the houses of the brothers. But Job is not happy. Job has at least generalized anxiety disorder, that maybe they're going to do something bad. And this is obviously an important part of his psychology. Why is he so anxious? And I mean, it's interesting, just as a side order, most of the rabbis ask the question, is Job Jewish? Because, you know, Jews tend to be anxious people because of our history and so forth. And they say, well, of course he's not Jewish, because he never doubts himself. And any Jew would doubt himself. It's an arrogance that he has to say, I didn't do anything wrong. Nobody can say that. Like, you know, he's not even checking his shadow. But if you think to the end of the book, what helped him get over his tremendous loss? Not his friends, not God, but his brothers and sisters who appear dramatically at the end of the book and have a morning ritual meal with him, give him morning gifts, and that helps him get over. And then the last thing of the book, which most people don't even read about, but I think makes him really the first feminist, is he has 10 more children, 7 boys, 3 girls. The boys are not mentioned. The girls are mentioned by name. And he says that he experienced them as the most beloved and beautiful, you know, lasses in the land. And the most important thing is he gives them an equal share in his inheritance.
Wow.
So if I go back to the beginning of the story and read this as a sibling story, he experienced the unconscious resentment of his daughters towards the brothers who got an excessive share. And through his suffering, he actually learned that no, even women count. Women are social people, and everyone has an equal share. And that, to me, is a profound lesson from the book of Job.
Yeah, oh, that's so fascinating. And is it not also intrapsychically? That it's restorative of the feminine.
Exactly. To be really in touch with the feminine, valuing the feminine, seeing it as something beautiful rather than the fear of the feminine, you know, to quote Neumann and things like that. Absolutely. It works equally well in this way.
I think the ritual that I think is so important. I know that Maria is very interested in ritual, and I must say it's shocking to me that until 30 days in Israel, it's not considered a person. They have changed now in Geneva, I would say at least 10, 15 years ago, and in other countries as well, that a stillborn child is shown to the parents, that the parents can spend time with the child. There is a memory box constituted where memories of the pregnancy or of the birth process, it's an actual box where memories are collected into it. And I think that's an important aspect of grieving, to create memories. And there is a yearly call from the hospital to have a yearly commemoration of the day on which this has happened. There are many good rituals now that can contain this unbearable loss. And it happens not only for stillbirth, it actually happens also for late losses in an advanced pregnancy, for a miscarriage, an advanced miscarriage. And maybe one would also wish to suggest that if a woman exerts her choice, that she consider, or both parents consider, such a letting go, consider a ritual to part. Because otherwise, I have seen that. I mean, one of the first replacement children came to me after 12 abortions she was conceived, because there was no birth control in the country in which she was born. You know, that specter, that fantasy, that absence is there also in the psyche, in the unconscious. So something that can contain that. I'm sure we will have a discussion
yes.
about.
Well, actually, I have a similar situation in my family where this cousin had twins, and one died shortly after birth. And not only did they give him a name, but they have an annual charity race in his honor every year. And I think you can be very creative and do the kind of things that you want.
Yes.
It also goes to a biblical idea, which is, what's the worst thing that can happen to you? Not to die, everybody's going to die, but have your name forgotten.
Yes.
So I think it is very important for siblings and things like that. And I do think, again, connecting to Job, that siblings are uniquely good at helping people through mourning.
Yeah. If they are allowed and their mourning is seen and not disenfranchised. And I think I would like to pay tribute here to the co-founders of the Replacement Child Forum, to Judy Mandel and Rita Battard, who both are replacement children, who both wrote a book, one a memoir, Judy Mandel, and Rita Battard has a book full of stories of replacement children sharing authentically their story. And there's been loss, you know, experienced firsthand by both authors. And they do the yard site, of course, as you would call it. They would do the memorial. They would do the presence, celebrate that day when that absence occurred. We are still present to them. They're gone, but we have the memory. I think that's a very important part of the grieving process. Yes.